and welcome again, everybody. And if you've joined us during the worship time, good morning, welcome. It's great to have you with us again. Today I'm going to be completing the series on nurturing faith in the wilderness. So we've been kind of going through the book of Numbers together in the Old Testament. And the book of Numbers, it's all about the people of Israel, wasn't it? When God had kind of set them free from slavery in Egypt, and he was leading them towards the land that he had promised them. Now, spoiler alert here, they don't go in. Well, at least a huge proportion, all but 2 people from that original generation don't get in, the descendants do. So sorry about that, spoiler alert, but you're going to be reading through that, I'm sure, in your own time. But in the book of Numbers, what we've been reading about is how the people of God, they were in that sort of in-between time. They're in between 2 realities of life in the wilderness. But what's really interesting is that in that place, in that wilderness season, God takes the opportunity to form them, to mold these people that he's chosen. And God initiated a whole series of practices and patterns and traditions among all the people out there in the desert. And those practices and traditions and things and patterns, they're practiced today, even today, among modern day Jews. And actually, if you think about it, our faith that we have in Jesus is very much rooted in the events that actually took place there in the wilderness, found in the book of Numbers. But the interesting thing is that these wilderness times in the Bible, they seem absolutely necessary. Throughout the scriptures, both the Old and New Testament, anyone who has any sort of significant or at least very specific roles in God's great story, they have to do time in the wilderness. It's like God does a work in his people. He does this sort of forming work in people's hearts in those wilderness seasons that he just doesn't do in any other time in the normal routines of life. So in this season, we have also been following the Bible Project. That is it. I was trying to remember what it was. We're kind of now going to come into the last section of one of their videos. It comes right off the back of what we were talking about last week when we were talking about Shrek and Donkey. Balaam and his donkey. Get that right. So we're going to come into that. It will help us sort of as we come to this last teaching session. So enjoy.
Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling, but up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
As Anne said a moment ago, we're going to continue to meet in this way. And I've got to say, I hate it. I just so miss us being together. I just miss all the sort of conversations, those chats that we have, and the ministry times, the worship time, just sharing together. I'm so gutted that we're still in this place for foreseeable anyway. So, but throughout this crazy pandemic season, we've been saying how it's kind of like we're also in that sort of in-between place, aren't we? We come from one season of life which was filled with all the expectations and the familiarities, all the practices, those routines of life that we come to become so familiar with. Those things have been completely disrupted, they've thrown up in the air, but we're heading towards something else. We're heading towards like a new reality, a new normality, whatever that will look like. And so what we've been saying is that we are, I believe, in a perfect place for God to form us and to teach us and maybe instigate new routines and patterns and desires and expectations to prepare us as we move forward to the next season in life. You know, at some point, we are going to emerge. We are going to come out of these restrictions and clampdowns. I hope it's soon. I don't know when. It may be weeks. It could be months. I mean, let's certainly hope it's not 40 years, like the Israelites. But the key thing is that we have opportunities, I think, to come out of, to exit this in-between season far more healthier than what we were when we stepped into it. Now, when I talk about being healthy, God's interest in our health is in the whole being. It's in terms of every part of what we are. So being healthy spiritually, being healthy mentally and emotionally, physically. Ange, for example, during this wilderness season, she's built a new routine of exercise. Yeah, in her life, she started to do regular running. Most mornings she gets up and goes out and goes running. By the way, she completed her couch to 5K this weekend. So big applause. Woohoo! Done a brilliant job. But so new routines. We've both been trying to form new sort of consistent habits of reading or listening to the scriptures and praying and trying to eat better. That one doesn't always work out so well, but we're trying, trying to form these new habits and new routines. But what's interesting is as we think about our lives that are on this verge of stepping into the next moment or stepping into the next season, this next part of the story of the book of Numbers, it challenges us to consider a couple of things before we do so. So that's what we're going to look at today, some of these considerations for the next season. And firstly, that is all about what have you learned about yourself, or what have you learned about God during this time? And that's a question I kind of popped out on our support group. I've had some great conversations surrounding that with some of you guys. So, but remember at a few weeks ago, we were looking at Numbers chapter 13, which was like 40 years earlier to the events that we're reading about today. And God's people were back then on the brink of entering into the promised land. They were right there. But they never did. They turned around because of their fears, their refusal to trust God. They opted not to go in. So now we're here in Numbers chapter 32. And as we were just hearing in the reading today, they're back at that place again. They're ready to actually go in. Are they going to go in? But the Reubenites and the Gadites, these are two of the 12 tribes of Israel, they come up to Moses and they say, listen, Moses, we'd rather not go in if that's okay. They began listing those whole bunch of areas that are really hard to pronounce, that Paul did really well in, but they list in all those places that were on that side of the Jordan where they were, and they was like saying, Moses, these places are quite cool. These places are really nice. We'd rather actually stay here than go into the land that God has promised us. And Moses then responds, and this is where we picked up. Actually, I'm going to come in at verse 6. I'm just going to scoot over this section again. And we've got it here in the Message version, which is quite funny, quite well put together. But so verse 6, it says, Moses answered the families of Gad and Reuben, do you mean that you are going to leave the fighting that's ahead to your brothers while you settle down here? Why would you even think of letting the people of Israel down, demoralizing them just as they're about to move into the land God gave them? That's exactly what your ancestors did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the country. You know, Moses then, throughout the rest of this chapter and on throughout the next chapter as well, he goes on to sort of remind them of all the things that they've gone through over the previous 40 years. So it's kind of like saying, listen, guys, let me just run by you all these events since Egypt up until now. Yes, we've known God's judgment. We've known his judgment in the desert, but we also know his intense blessing. We've encountered his hand of provision in so many ways. He's empowered us or enabled us to overcome our enemies. He's brought us all this way here, and we're here we're at that sort of place again. And it's like he's like saying, look at what has happened. Have you not learned anything that we've kind of come through up until this point? And I think that's a really good question for us today. Have you learned anything? Have you learned anything about yourself, anything about God during this time? Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever found yourself thinking, how many times do I have to keep going around this loop, making the same bad choices over and over again? Or have you observed it in somebody else? Because, you always learn those life lessons the first time round, don't you, right? Yeah. But have you ever seen that in others, when they're kind of going round a particular struggle or a set of circumstances over and over again because they don't seem to have learned the lesson? Have you ever found yourself having to say to somebody like, are you going to go ahead and sort of date another loser again like you did before, in spite of all that your friends are saying, in spite of what that jerk did to you last time? You're ignoring that? Or have you had to say to a friend something like, so what, you're getting another credit card? You're having another loan taken out again? Have you forgotten what the previous 2 or 3 times happened when you did that? It didn't really go so well for you, did it? I just think often we recognize those loops. We see or notice those loops in other people more than, or it seems to be harder to notice those things or recognize them in ourselves. For Ange and I, we've made some really bad choices when it came to buying cars. I mean, we've never had much money, so we always had to take out loans, and we would borrow, just about as much as we could possibly afford to pay back. And we've ended up sort of just going through and rushing a purchase through and coming away with some really bad cars. But each time I've come away thinking, oh, wow, I'm not going to be caught out like that again. I'm going to get so much more careful the next time we get a car. I'm going to be really, really careful. And then sort of 3 years later, we're in the market again for another car. And it's like the desires to get this specific car that I'm now looking at, or just the sheer need to get a car right now, seems to override the previous statement about me making better choices the next time round. It's like, I forgot that lesson all again. And so again, we're going around that loop over and over again. So that's the first thing. I think the next thing that this passage calls us to consider, and it's based on an expression, I don't know whether you've heard this expression, never waste a lesson. Never waste a lesson. I think that's a great expression. It's a great saying for us to consider today during this crazy season. Do you know I was saying how God, he teaches us things in the wilderness times that he doesn't teach us in any other sort of area of life. The question is, all of that what God has taught you, or is at least trying to teach you during this season, have you learned? Have you learned? Have you grown? Has something changed in you during this season? Or will you need to go through yet another wilderness again and again and again? And so I think it's important for us not to waste lessons learned. The next consideration, I think, is kind of an extension of that, sort of not wasting lessons. The next one is all about learning from mistakes that are made. So never Never waste a lesson. That's a really good expression, a good saying. But I know a better one. A better one for me, I think, is it's good to learn from your mistakes, but it's even better to learn from someone else's. You know? and this is kind of what Moses is saying to the Reubenites and the Gadites. He's saying, did you not learn something from the things that God has taught you on this journey? And did you not learn from what those, all those sort of bad choices that your ancestors made all those years ago? And I mean, during this period, in this sort of talk, this pep talk that Moses was given, he wasn't pulling any punches here. He was like, because of all the disobedience of your ancestors back then, we've all ended up having to wander around in the wilderness for the last 40 years. And what's more, God has said that you won't go in, or you won't be able to go in until the last of all those from that older generation has died. I mean, these are kind of crazy sideline thought, if you like. Can you imagine what it would have been like for that last person alive from that whole generation? How that made them think? Think about all the other people around him. Hey, George, you feeling okay today? No? I mean, you kind of look a little bit tired today. You look a bit worn out. I'm just kind of checking. I just need to know, because we don't get to go in until you die. Poor guy. Anyway, so all that they've gone through, everything that God has shown them and done for them, and they're still here at this place saying, no, we'd rather not fight. We'd rather stay here. We'll stay in this place. And then Moses said, you need to understand that your decisions that you make, those choices that you make, they won't just affect you. They're going to affect everyone else as well. In verses 14 and 15, it says, and now here you are, just one more mob of sinners, stepping up to replace your ancestors, throwing fuel on the already blazing anger of God against Israel. And get this, if you won't follow him, he'll do it again. He'll dump them, and he's talking about all Israel now. He'll dump them in the desert, and the disaster will be all your fault. Whoa, that's a bit serious. But I think this is the next thing for us to consider. The Bible teaches us over and over again that our actions and our choices, they affect others, not just ourselves. So sin and disobedience and never learning lessons, it's never an individual thing. It's always a corporate thing. It's a together thing. It always affects more people than what we first intended or ever intended. Of course, when we kind of go through this, I can't help but think about that in relation to all the choices that we make and the things that we do as individuals during this pandemic time. The whole thing about adhering to the advice given regarding, wearing face coverings whilst you're around other people and maintaining social distancing and washing hands and so on and so forth. The choices that we make don't just affect us, they affect others. And in fact, we've seen that, haven't we, on the news, all those reports about how the bad choices of a few have huge implications on all of us at some stage, right? But also in relation to what God is teaching you at this time. Are you learning? Because that what you learn, or that what you don't learn, is so often it has a bearing on those around you. So is God teaching you anything about your attitude to work versus family? So during this season, have you been kind of learning about getting that balance right? Have you been one who is normally so absorbed by your work and have very little time that you can give to your spouse or your kids or whatever? I've heard so many times, maybe you have too, of people talking about how they've kind of realised during this time that they've totally missed out on that sort of quality family time. During this pandemic, it just seems it's brought that to the forefront. Now, what God is teaching you during this time, what is it? Is it in regards to the relationships you have? Or is it the relationships that you realize you don't have and you absolutely need at this time? Have you invested in friendships that enable you to endure such times as that, what we're going through right now? What has God been teaching you about prayer? You know, that need to sort of have your day undergirded, completely undergirded by prayer and worship. You know, during this season, have you learnt to become more dependent on God? Whatever it is, you and I need to hold tight to those things that we're learning. Don't waste it. Don't lose the lesson. And then the final thing to consider is, you know, what it is that you have learned and you're learning during this time. Because, you know, what is that? Because the lessons we have learned, we need to take into the next season. That what God is teaching us right now at this time, we need to take that to the next moment, to the next season. For the people of Israel in the wilderness, all that they'd learned during that time, they were going to have to, it would have a direct effect, an impact on how they approach this next opportunity that lay ahead of them, how they would enter into the promised land. Were they going to actually learn those lessons and enter with a new confidence and a new trust in God? Were they going to allow themselves to become even more dependent on his provision and in his strength and in his enabling to overcome future challenges and battles? Do you know, for each of us, even after this crazy time that we're going through, going forward, every single one of us are going to face further challenges, more giants, more battles. There's absolutely going to be moments where things in our lives just don't seem to go right, where things just seem so confusing and God seems so distant from us. Yeah, most of us, if not all of us, one day we're going to be sick. We're going to fall sick of something, or we'll have a loved one fall sick, or even die, sadly. But every one of us has something, or will have something that breaks in life. You know, it could be relate to our finances, or relationship, our job, or whatever it is. But the crucial thing is that we take the things that we learn during this time into the next time. Maybe this wilderness time has taught you that you need to work harder on your marriage, or that you need to take more time out to be with your kids, the people that are really important to you. Maybe you've learned new ways to connect with God through prayer or worship. But whatever it is, take those things with you. Take the lessons learned and grow. And that's what I just want to encourage us all to do over the coming days and weeks. And I know some already have or already are. As I say, I've had some real great life-giving conversations through chats and online stuff and emails and so on. But I just want to encourage you to take that time to really ask that question. What am I learning at this time? What is it that God is desiring to grow in me during this wilderness season? And don't waste those lessons that you're learning. It's so important, because that what we learn, it doesn't just impact us. It's not just us and our own life going forward. It impacts the lives of others around us, our families, our friends, our kids, those that we lead or have influence over. And then lastly, I want to urge us to keep a real tight grip on those things that you are learning at this time, and never let it go, but take it with you. Take it to the next moment. Take it into the next season, that we're going to be more prepared, less disorientated, better equipped for tomorrow's crises as they come along, because they're going to come along. May we not find ourselves needing to venture round and round that wilderness place again, learning and relearning, but growing. Amen.